Hello again, and happy Friday, local time from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. Australia has been ruled since 2013 by the centre-right Liberal National Coalition. Since 2018, its prime minister has been the current Liberal Party's leader, Scott Morrison. And according to critics, various liberal and left-wing and environmentalist critics, uh, Australia is only slowly changing its environmentalist policy to become more active in protecting its environment. This analysis, which is copied from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's website, and which I'm not going to read in its entirety, seeks to answer the question of why Australia has been so slow until now to react to the growing environmental crisis and climate change. So, um, the article has been written by political reporter Melissa Clark and dated December the 10th. Advocates for greater action on climate change can feel the momentum. The big Mo is swinging their way. But if they were hoping the momentum would sweep up the Australian federal government and see Prime Minister Scott Morrison join the wash of nations committing to net zero emissions by 2050, disappointment awaits. This weekend, the United Nations, Britain and France will host a virtual summit for world leaders to demonstrate new enhanced ambition on emissions reduction. Britain, as host of the next round of global climate negotiations in Glasgow, Scotland, postponed until 2021 because of the COVID-19 pandemic, is pushing hard for nations to come with significant contributions to make. Britain's Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson will address the summit, having promised a 68% reduction in emissions by 2030 based on the 1990 emissions levels. Were US President-elect Joe Biden in office this week, he would no doubt get a Guernsey for committing to rejoin the Paris Agreement and promising net zero emissions by 2050. Japan, South Korea, and the European Union have committed to net zero emissions by 2050 and China by 2060. Unlikely Australia will be on the rundown. Australia's federal government is sticking with its current commitment of 26 to 28% emissions reduction by 2030 based on 2005 levels, which is miserly compared to Britain's recent commitment. Prime Minister Morrison's hazy commitment to reach net zero emissions in the second half of the century doesn't cut it either. He still declares that the carryover credits will not be needed, but it's not the same as conceding their illegitimacy. While using carryover credits is not explicitly banned under the rules of the Paris Agreement, Australia's federal government has found no support diplomatically from allies for claiming them. Scott Morrison, if he was to be given the chance, would use the summit as a roadshow of the technology investment roadmap. In short, it is using public funds to back development of hydrogen power, electricity storage, renewable energy, low-emission steel production, carbon capture and storage, and soil carbon measurement. The ruling National Liberal Coalition promotes the plan as a practical approach to tackling climate focused on how rather than when emissions will be reduced. It is prioritizing the unknown over the known. It is not what the organizers of the Climate Ambition Summit are looking for. Australia's relatively weak target, so about or just over 1/4 reduction by 2030 from 2005, is not just a function of the parlous state of climate politics in Canberra, Australia's capital. It is also abetted by the camel of a compromise that is the Paris Agreement. The Morrison government is using that structure to its advantage. Countries were supposed to lodge their 5-year update this year at Glasgow, but COVID-19 has seen it pushed back until November 2021. While some countries like Britain are updating their emissions reduction targets this year anyway, Australia is putting it off until next year. The delay has bought New Zealand some breathing space too. The newly re-elected Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who as the leader of the Labour Party at least technically should be much friendlier to the climate change activists than the centre-right Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, has offered vocal support for climate action, culminating in New Zealand's parliament declaring a climate emergency last week. However, in practice, New Zealand's actions have not quite matched the rhetoric, because New Zealand's emissions have continued to rise since 1990. Britain, which is still under the Commonwealth of Nations system, technically the mother country of Australia and New Zealand, because its monarch, currently Elizabeth II, is still nominally, theoretically, their head of state, has pressured Australia and New Zealand to step up their action. 2 weeks ago, the British High Commissioner for Australia, Vicky Treadell, was almost in tears as she spoke at a function in Canberra of the need for a stronger global action on climate change. Her counterpart in Wellington, New Zealand's capital, Laura Clark, has admonished the New Zealand government for a gap between ambition and reality. Pacific nations will pile on the pressure too when Scott Morrison and Jacinda Ardern join a meeting of Pacific Island Forum leaders on Friday, December the 11th, 2020, on the eve of the Climate Ambition Summit. The chairperson of the Pacific Island Forum, Tuvalu Prime Minister Kozia Natano, called the meeting in an effort to coordinate the region's push for stronger global action. The Pacific Island leaders, or we could say Oceanian countries' leaders, want Australia to be more ambitious and to use its middle power status to advance their cause. After all, Australia is by far the largest and the most populous of the Oceanian countries in the Southern Pacific. They will be disappointed but not surprised by Australia's resistance to the global momentum for action. Former Australian Prime Minister and Liberal Party leader Tony Abbott, no friend of climate change action, would say Australia should do its part, but no more than its fair share. With new commitments from Britain, the United States, China, Japan, and South Korea, it could be argued Australia's fair share is now more than 26 to 28% by 2030 and reaching of net zero sometime before 2100. So why not lift Australia's ambition? According to this analyst and journalist, Scott Morrison is a pragmatist. So a pragmatist doesn't look for ideologically pure solutions, but rather for what is politically practical to achieve. Pragmatists tend to be middle of the road, according to their critics, greatly devious leaders. According to their defenders, they are leaders who are careful not to divide their countries over politically, socially, culturally, or otherwise, or economically sensitive issues. So he will shift when he has to, but that does not mean he's looking for opportunities to do so. There is the clunky international system that allows weak national contributions and opposition that can't settle its own approach to climate change. In Australia, it's most of, for example, the Labour Party and the Greens. And plenty of other issues on the agenda demanding attention, a global pandemic no less. The momentum for action on climate change is growing, but there is not yet enough power in it to budge the ruling Liberal National Coalition.